Partition of Palestine, 1947 to 1948. The story begins with the end of the British Mandate in Palestine. After World War II, the world had witnessed the horrors of the Holocaust. Millions of Jewish survivors were displaced, searching for a homeland. At the same time, the Arab majority in Palestine, living on their ancestral land, demanded independence. In 1947, the United Nations proposed a partition plan. Divide Palestine into two states, one Jewish, one Arab. Jerusalem would remain under international control. The Jewish leadership accepted. The Arab leadership rejected. Why? Because the plan allocated 56% of the land to Jews, who were only about 1/3 of the population at the time. For Palestinians, it felt like a theft of their homeland. Then came May 14, 1948. The Jewish leadership declared the creation of the State of Israel. The very next day, 5 Arab armies, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, launched a war to prevent the new state from surviving. The war that Palestinians call the Nakba, the catastrophe. The Nakba and Gaza's transformation as the fighting raged. Over 700,000 Palestinians were expelled or fled from their homes. Entire villages were wiped off the map. Families carried only what they could in their hands. Tens of thousands of these refugees poured into Gaza, a narrow coastal strip that suddenly became home to a population 3 times larger than before. The Egyptian army took control of Gaza during the war. Israel had pushed deep into the strip but halted short of full annexation, largely because of international pressure. By 1949, a fragile armistice was signed. Israel had won, expanding beyond the UN plan. The West Bank fell under Jordanian control, but Gaza, it remained under Egyptian administration. Thus, the modern Gaza Strip was born, a haven for Palestinian refugees, a land under Egyptian rule, and a wound that would not heal. Gaza under Egyptian administration, 1948 to 1967. Life in Gaza during these years was grim. The Strip was only about 365 square kilometers. Yet by 1950 it housed more than 200,000 refugees, packed into camps run by the newly created UNRWA, United Nations Relief and Works Agency. Tents replaced homes. Poverty replaced livelihoods. Generations of children grew up behind barbed wire, carrying memories of villages they would never see again. Egypt, while administering Gaza, never annexed it. Palestinians there had no citizenship, neither Egyptian, nor their lost Palestinian one. They lived in a political limbo. But something else was growing inside Gaza: anger and resistance. The rise of the Fedayeen. By the early 1950s, young Palestinians began organizing Fedayeen raids, cross-border guerrilla attacks against Israel. They struck settlements, ambushed patrols, and tried to reclaim lost land. For many, these raids were an act of desperation, a way to fight back against displacement and humiliation. Israel, in turn, responded with harsh reprisals. Whole villages in Gaza were bombed. Civilians were killed. The cycle of attack and retaliation had begun. One of the most infamous events came in 1953, when an Israeli unit led by Ariel Sharon raided the West Bank village of Kibbutz, killing dozens of civilians. Though not in Gaza, it sent shockwaves through Palestinian communities there, fueling rage and fear. By the mid-1950s, Gaza had become a battlefield in waiting. The Suez Crisis of 1956 then came the Suez Crisis. In July 1956, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, angering Britain and France. In secret, Israel joined them in a military plan. Israel would invade the Sinai Peninsula and Gaza, giving Britain and France a pretext to intervene. And so, in October 1956, Israeli troops swept into Gaza. For the first time, Gaza was under direct Israeli military occupation. The occupation lasted only a few months, but it was brutal. Hundreds of Palestinians were killed. Resistance fighters were executed. Refugee camps were raided. But international pressure, especially from the United States and the Soviet Union, forced Israel to withdraw in early 1957. Egypt regained control. Still, the episode had left scars and a warning of what was to come. Life in the camps through the 1960s, Gaza remained a place of despair. The refugee camps, meant to be temporary, became permanent. Overcrowding, disease, and unemployment plagued daily life. Palestinians longed to return to their homes in what was now Israel, but that dream was slipping further away with each passing year. Yet out of this despair, a new political consciousness was forming. Students, workers, and refugees began to rally behind the idea of Palestinian nationalism. They were no longer just refugees waiting to go home. They were a people demanding liberation. And this nationalism was increasingly tied to the newly emerging Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO. Tensions rise before the storm. By the mid-1960s, the Arab-Israeli conflict was heating up again. Border skirmishes intensified. Syria clashed with Israel in the north. And in Gaza, Fedayeen attacks continued to provoke Israeli retaliation. At the same time, Palestinian groups like Fatah, founded by Yasser Arafat, were gaining popularity. Gaza became a breeding ground for these movements. Egypt allowed some freedom for the PLO to organize but kept tight control, fearful that Gaza might slip into chaos or drag Egypt into another war. Yet chaos was coming whether Egypt wanted it or not. The Six-Day War looms, 1967. In early 1967, tensions exploded. Egypt closed the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping. Arab armies mobilized. Israel prepared for war. And on June 5, 1967, it began. In just 6 days, Israel launched preemptive strikes that destroyed the Egyptian, Syrian, and Jordanian air forces. It captured the West Bank, East Jerusalem, the Golan Heights, and the Gaza Strip. For the second time, Gaza fell under Israeli military occupation. But this time, it would not be temporary. The occupation would last for decades, reshaping the lives of every Palestinian in Gaza. By 1967, the Gaza Strip was no longer just a refugee camp under Egyptian control. It was now an occupied land. Its people, already displaced once, now faced the iron grip of a new ruler. The shock of 1967, the Six-Day War, changed everything. In less than a week, Israel had redrawn the map of the Middle East. For Palestinians in Gaza, the war was not just another defeat. It was the beginning of a new reality. On June 9, 1967, Israeli troops marched into Gaza City. Tanks rolled past refugee camps. The Egyptian administration had collapsed overnight. Palestinians who once lived under British, then Egyptian rule, now found themselves under the control of Israel, the very state they saw as responsible for their displacement in 1948. For many, it was the second Nakba. Daily life under occupation. What did this occupation look like? At first, Israel tried to present it as a benevolent occupation. Roads were paved, schools were monitored, and permits were handed out. But beneath the surface was a system of control that shaped every aspect of life. Military rule. Israeli officers held absolute authority. Curfews, checkpoints, and home raids became routine. Permits. Want to leave Gaza for work? You needed a permit. Travel? Permit. Even access to farmland was tightly regulated. Economic dependency. Thousands of Gazans crossed into Israel daily for labor, building houses and cleaning streets, but always at the mercy of Israeli employers and the army's security restrictions. At the same time, Israel began something that would define decades of conflict. Settlements. The first settlements in Gaza in 1968, Israel established Kfar Darim, one of the first Jewish settlements in Gaza since 1948. By the mid-1970s, more settlements were being built, especially along the southern coast. These settlements, heavily guarded and strategically placed, took up prime agricultural land and restricted Palestinian movement. For Palestinians, it felt like history repeating itself. First, they lost their villages in 1948. Now, even in Gaza, pieces of their land were being carved away. The rise of resistance but occupation did not go uncontested. Palestinian nationalism had been growing for years, and Gaza became one of its main strongholds. The Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, led by Yasser Arafat, began organizing attacks from Gaza. Young men joined underground cells. Leaflets circulated secretly in refugee camps. The message was clear: Israel would not be accepted as a permanent ruler. The Israeli army responded with crackdowns. Suspected militants were arrested, homes demolished, and curfews enforced. Collective punishment became a common tactic. If one person attacked, entire neighborhoods suffered. This cycle of resistance and repression hardened the resolve of both sides. Egypt-Israel peace and Gaza's isolation in 1973, another war broke out, the Yom Kippur War. Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack on Israel. At first, Arab forces made gains, but within weeks, Israel counterattacked. The war ended with Egypt regaining parts of the Sinai. And in 1979, Egypt signed a historic peace treaty with Israel. For Israel, it was a diplomatic breakthrough. For Egypt, it was the return of the Sinai Peninsula. But for Gaza, it was abandonment. The treaty mentioned nothing about Palestinian statehood, nothing about Gaza's future. For Gazans, it felt like Egypt had closed the door on their struggle, leaving them trapped under Israeli rule. The growth of settlements and economic strain during the 1980s, Israeli settlements in Gaza expanded. By 1987, about 3,000 settlers lived in heavily fortified enclaves, protected by thousands of soldiers, while nearly 800,000 Palestinians lived just miles away in poverty. The contrast was striking. Settlers had lush farms and greenhouses, with constant water and electricity. Palestinians endured shortages, restrictions, and overcrowding. Gaza became one of the most densely populated places on Earth, and one of the poorest. At the same time, unemployment rose. Many Palestinians worked inside Israel, but their wages were low and unstable. Families depended on remittances from abroad. The younger generation, frustrated and angry, began looking for new ways to fight back. Islamic movements take root. Until the 1980s, Palestinian resistance was dominated by secular groups like Fatah and the PLO. But in Gaza, something new was emerging: Islamist organizations. One of the most influential was Sheikh Ahmed Yassin's Islamic Center, established in the 1970s. It started as a religious and charitable network, building mosques, schools, and clinics. But beneath the charity was a growing political movement. By the mid-1980s, this movement would evolve into Hamas. Unlike the PLO, Hamas framed the conflict not only as a national struggle, but as a religious duty. Their slogan was simple: all of Palestine was Islamic land, and compromise was unacceptable. This set the stage for a future rivalry that would dominate Palestinian politics. The spark before the fire. By 1987, tensions in Gaza were at a breaking point. Refugee camps were overcrowded. Israeli settlements kept expanding. Youth unemployment was soaring. Palestinians felt abandoned by Arab states and betrayed by Egypt's peace with Israel. And then, on December 8, 1987, it happened. An Israeli military truck collided with a Palestinian car in Gaza, killing 4 workers. To many Palestinians, it was not just an accident. It was a symbol of their oppression. The next day, protests erupted in the Jabalia refugee camp. Stones were thrown. Tires were burned. Israeli troops responded with bullets and tear gas. The fire had been lit. The first Intifada begins. What started in one camp spread across Gaza, then into the West Bank. The first Intifada, uprising, had begun. This was not just another wave of violence. It was a mass movement involving every layer of society. Youth hurled stones at soldiers. Women organized underground schools when Israel shut down classrooms. Shopkeepers closed businesses in strikes. Neighbors formed committees to run daily life without Israeli control. The occupation had never faced anything like this. Israel responded with force. Soldiers were ordered to break the bones of protesters to deter them. Thousands were arrested. Hundreds were killed. But the more Israel cracked down, the stronger the uprising grew. And at the center of it all was Gaza, the beating heart of resistance. By the late 1980s, Gaza was no longer just a strip of land under occupation. It was the spark of a revolution. The uprising would change Palestinian identity forever. It would give birth to Hamas as a political force, and it would force the world to confront the Palestinian struggle in a way it never had before. The streets ignite. December 1987. The Jabalia refugee camp in Gaza was on fire. Crowds of young Palestinians filled the narrow streets, hurling stones at armored jeeps. Israeli soldiers fired live ammunition, rubber bullets, and tear gas. But something was different this time. This wasn't just a skirmish. It wasn't just Fedayeen fighters or militants. It was ordinary people, students, laborers, mothers, shopkeepers. Entire communities were rising. The first Intifada had begun. Stone versus rifle. The image of the Intifada became iconic. A teenager in sneakers and a keffiyeh, hurling a stone at an Israeli tank. It was the ultimate symbol of asymmetry. One side had the world's most advanced army. The other had little more than stones, slingshots, and burning tires. But it was not just about weapons. It was about psychology. Every stone thrown carried a message. We are here. We will not vanish. We will not surrender. Israel, caught off guard by the scale of the uprising, responded with overwhelming force. Defense Minister Yitzhak Rabin famously ordered soldiers to break the bones of protesters, literally using clubs to shatter arms and legs as punishment. Far from crushing the rebellion, this brutality fueled it. The role of Gaza. While the Intifada spread across the West Bank, Gaza was its epicenter. Refugee camps like Jabalia, Rafah, and Khan Yunis turned into fortresses of defiance. Youth organized neighborhood patrols and set up barricades. Underground leaflets circulated instructions: when to strike, when to protest, when to boycott. Israel tried curfews, mass arrests, and deportations. But for every leader arrested, 10 more stepped forward. The Intifada was not led by one man. It was a movement of the people. The birth of Hamas. But beneath this spontaneous uprising, a new organized force was emerging. In December 1987, just as the Intifada began, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin and his followers formally created Harakat al-Muqawama al-Islamiyya, Hamas. Unlike the secular PLO, Hamas blended nationalism with religion. Its founding charter declared, "Israel will exist until Islam obliterates it." To Hamas, compromise with Israel was impossible. The struggle was both political and spiritual. In the early Intifada, Hamas focused on social services, running schools, charities, and mosques, while gradually building its military wing. For many in Gaza's crowded camps, Hamas offered something the PLO could not: food, dignity, and a sense of belonging. Israel, ironically, had once tolerated Yassin's Islamic networks as a counterweight to the PLO. But now, that decision was coming back to haunt them. The human cost. The Intifada was not just a political uprising, it was a humanitarian disaster. From 1987 to 1993, over 1,000 Palestinians were killed, many of them children and teenagers. Tens of thousands were injured. Entire neighborhoods were placed under round-the-clock curfews. Schools were shut down for months. Israel lost around 200 soldiers and civilians in the violence. But the images of heavily armed soldiers confronting stone-throwing children began to dominate global media. For the first time, the Palestinian struggle was televised. The world watches. CNN, BBC, and other networks broadcasted footage from Gaza streets. The world saw soldiers breaking bones, children coughing from tear gas, funerals marching daily through refugee camps. Public opinion shifted. In Europe, student movements began rallying for Palestinian rights. In the US, debates raged in Congress about Israel's tactics. The Intifada transformed the Palestinian cause from a distant geopolitical issue into a human story of resistance and suffering. Israel's dilemma. For Israel, the Intifada posed an impossible question: crack down harder? Risk global condemnation? Negotiate? That meant legitimizing the PLO, whom Israel had long branded as terrorists. Meanwhile, the uprising showed no signs of stopping. Boycotts of Israeli goods spread. Palestinians refused to pay taxes. Work stoppages paralyzed industries. The cost of occupation was mounting, not just morally but economically. The PLO's struggle from abroad at the time, Yasser Arafat and the PLO leadership were in exile, first in Lebanon and later in Tunisia. From thousands of miles away, they watched as a new generation of Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank took the lead. The PLO had always claimed to represent Palestinians, but the Intifada revealed a growing gap. Inside Gaza, many saw the exiled leadership as disconnected from their daily struggles. Still, Arafat knew the Intifada was an opportunity. He worked to align the movement with the PLO, ensuring that any future negotiations would pass through him. The rise of martyrdom culture as the Intifada dragged on, a new culture of resistance took hold. Funerals of martyrs became mass political rallies. Posters of the dead decorated camp walls. Songs, poems, and graffiti turned fallen youth into symbols of defiance. Every death fueled another protest. Every crackdown brought more recruits. For Israel, this was a nightmare, a self-sustaining cycle of resistance. International shifts by the early 1990s, cracks were appearing in the global order. The Cold War was ending. The US emerged as the world's only superpower. Arab states, weakened by economic troubles and internal strife, grew tired of endless war. At the same time, the Intifada had made one thing undeniable. Palestinians could not be ignored any longer. For decades, Israel and the West had dismissed them as refugees or terrorists. Now, the world recognized them as a people demanding self-determination. The road to negotiations in 1991, the Madrid Conference brought Israelis and Palestinians to the same table for the first time. It was a breakthrough, but progress was slow. Behind the scenes, secret talks began in Norway. Israeli academics and PLO officials met quietly, away from the cameras, searching for common ground. Out of these meetings would emerge something unprecedented: the Oslo Accords. But before Oslo, Gaza's uprising would claim yet more lives. The shadow of Hamas by 1992, Hamas was no longer just a social movement. Its military wing, the ad-Din al-Qassam brigades, was carrying out attacks against Israeli soldiers and civilians. Suicide bombings were still rare at this point, but the foundations were being laid. Hamas sought to position itself as the uncompromising alternative to the PLO's diplomacy. This would set the stage for a rivalry that would split Palestinian politics for decades. The uprising fades, but does not end by 1993. After 6 years of relentless protests, strikes, and clashes, the Intifada began to lose momentum. Exhaustion set in. Gaza's economy was shattered. Families had endured years of loss. Yet the uprising had achieved something extraordinary. It had forced the world to recognize Palestinians as a nation, and it had pushed Israel into negotiations it had long resisted. In September 1993, on the White House lawn in Washington, D.C., Yasser Arafat shook hands with Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. The Oslo Accords had been signed. For Gaza, it was a moment of hope, perhaps the greatest since 1948. For the first time, Palestinians were promised a future of self-rule. Gaza would no longer just be an occupied land. It would become the launching ground of a state in the making. But hope is fragile. And in Gaza, hope had a way of being crushed. A handshake that shook the world September 13, 1993. The White House lawn, cameras flashing, journalists holding their breath. And there they were, Yitzhak Rabin, the former Israeli general who once vowed to crush the Intifada, and Yasser Arafat, the exiled guerrilla leader of the PLO. They shook hands. The world gasped. This was the Oslo Accords, a bold attempt to end decades of bloodshed. For Palestinians in Gaza, the handshake meant something extraordinary. For the first time, Israel had recognized them as a people with legitimate political rights. For the first time, the word peace felt real. The birth of the Palestinian Authority as part of the agreement, Israel agreed to withdraw from parts of Gaza and the West Bank. In exchange, the PLO would recognize Israel and renounce armed struggle. In 1994, the Palestinian Authority, PA, was created, and Yasser Arafat returned from exile to Gaza in triumph. Crowds filled the streets. Refugees wept. Families waved Palestinian flags freely for the first time. For many, it felt like a new dawn. The PA set up ministries, police forces, and schools. The world rushed in with aid. The US, Europe, and Arab states pledged billions of dollars to support the peace process. For once, Gaza wasn't just a battlefield, it was a laboratory of state building. Dreams of development throughout the mid-1990s, Gaza saw projects that had once been unimaginable. New roads and infrastructure, investment in telecommunications, plans for an international airport and seaport. Foreign leaders visited. Diplomats smiled. Donors wrote checks. The narrative was clear. Gaza would become the Singapore of the Middle East. But beneath the optimism, cracks were already forming. The harsh realities of occupation even after Oslo, Gaza was not free. Yes, Israel withdrew from some urban centers, but it retained control over borders, airspace, and the sea. Every import, every export, every movement of people all still depended on Israeli approval. Checkpoints choked movement. Work permits remained uncertain. And every time violence erupted, Israel sealed Gaza off, strangling its fragile economy. To Palestinians, it felt like autonomy on paper, but occupation in practice. Corruption and disillusionment. Meanwhile, the Palestinian Authority quickly lost its shine. Arafat's leadership style was authoritarian. Aid money vanished into the hands of elites. Jobs went to those with political connections, not qualifications. Ordinary Gazans, who had dreamed of freedom, now found themselves stuck between Israeli control and Palestinian corruption. Hamas, still in its early years, seized on this. Its leaders pointed to failing schools, poverty, and nepotism, blaming both Israel and the PA. In the streets, Hamas's popularity began to grow. The rise of Hamas during Oslo while the PA negotiated, Hamas positioned itself as the uncompromising alternative. Its message was simple. Oslo was a betrayal. Palestine should never be divided. Israel should never be accepted. Hamas carried out suicide bombings inside Israel, aiming to derail the peace process. Each attack was devastating, not only in human cost but in political fallout. Israel responded with closures and collective punishments in Gaza. The cycle of retaliation returned. For every bomb, another checkpoint. For every crackdown, another recruit to Hamas. The dream of peace was slipping away. Jerusalem, the unsolved question. One of Oslo's greatest weaknesses was what it didn't solve. The status of Jerusalem, the fate of Palestinian refugees, the question of Israeli settlements. These issues were postponed for final status negotiations. But while talks dragged on, Israel continued expanding settlements in the West Bank. To Palestinians, this was proof that Israel was negotiating peace with one hand while grabbing land with the other. In Gaza, bitterness deepened. The fragile hope of 1996 to 1999. Despite the obstacles, there were still moments when hope flickered. In 1996, elections were held in Gaza and the West Bank. Yasser Arafat became the first elected president of the Palestinian Authority. International observers hailed it as progress. That same year, the Gaza International Airport opened with fanfare. Airplanes bearing Palestinian colors landed and took off, a symbol of nationhood, even if limited. In 1998, at the Y River Memorandum, new agreements promised further Israeli withdrawals. But these gestures were always temporary, fragile, reversible. Every time trust was built, it was shattered again. The collapse of trust by the late 1990s, disillusionment was everywhere. Palestinians saw settlements expanding, not shrinking. Israelis saw Hamas suicide bombings and questioned whether peace was possible. Both sides accused each other of bad faith. When Benjamin Netanyahu became Israel's prime minister in 1996, he slowed down the peace process even further, catering to settlers and right-wing opposition to Oslo. Then in 2000, Ehud Barak tried to revive talks at Camp David with U.S. President Bill Clinton. The summit failed. The core issues, Jerusalem, refugees, and statehood, remained unsolved. A visit that lit the fuse on September 28, 2000, Israeli opposition leader Ariel Sharon visited the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, a site sacred to both Jews and Muslims. To Palestinians, it was a deliberate provocation. Protests erupted. Israeli police opened fire. Within days, the fragile Oslo peace was gone. The Second Intifada had begun. For Gazans, the 1990s had been a roller coaster. They had tasted hope, airports, elections, the dream of peace. But that hope collapsed into rage. Now, Gaza would plunge once again into violence, this time far bloodier than before. The Second Intifada would turn Gaza into a war zone. And by the end of it, Israel itself would leave Gaza behind. In a way no one expected. An explosion of fury, the year 2000 was supposed to bring peace. Instead, it brought fire. After Ariel Sharon's controversial visit to Jerusalem's Temple Mount, protests erupted across Gaza and the West Bank. Within hours, clashes with Israeli forces turned deadly. The tension spread like wildfire. Stones were thrown. Bullets answered. And Gaza, already bruised by years of occupation and failed promises, became the beating heart of a new uprising, the Second Intifada. What made this Intifada different? The First Intifada had been marked by stones, boycotts, and civil disobedience. The Second Intifada was different. It was far bloodier. Palestinian militants now used rifles, explosives, and suicide bombings. Israeli forces responded with tanks, missiles, and heavy bombardments. Gaza's dense neighborhoods became battlegrounds. The death toll mounted quickly. By the end of the Intifada, over 3,000 Palestinians and 1,000 Israelis were dead. Tens of thousands were wounded. Every funeral fueled another cycle of rage. Life in Gaza during the Intifada for ordinary Gazans, daily life collapsed. Checkpoints and roadblocks cut Gaza off from the world. Work permits for Israel were cancelled. Families lost their only income. Helicopters thundered overhead. Drones began to appear for the first time, buzzing constantly. The economy was strangled. Poverty soared above 60. Children who had once dreamed of studying abroad now grew up under siege. Their schools often closed, their homes at risk of demolition. For them, the Oslo dream of peace was already a distant memory. Hamas gained strength while the Palestinian Authority tried to hold on. Its credibility evaporated. President Yasser Arafat was confined by Israel to his compound in Ramallah, cut off from his people. The PA's corruption and inability to deliver peace made it weaker than ever. Hamas, on the other hand, was rising. Its leaders, many of them based in Gaza, used the chaos to recruit. They built networks of charity, social aid, and military cells. They positioned themselves as the true defenders of Palestine. Suicide bombings in Israeli cities shocked the world. Each attack hardened Israeli public opinion against negotiations and pushed Israel further toward military solutions. The Israeli response: Israel responded with overwhelming force. Apache helicopters launched missiles into Gaza City. Tanks rolled along the border. Entire neighborhoods were bulldozed, accused of harboring militants. In 2004, Israel assassinated Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, Hamas's spiritual founder, in an airstrike as he left a mosque in Gaza. Weeks later, his successor Abdul Aziz al-Rantizi was killed the same way. The message was clear: Israel would strike the leadership of Hamas directly. But instead of weakening Hamas, these assassinations often strengthened its image as a movement of martyrs. The walls closing in by 2002, Israel had built a massive separation barrier in the West Bank. Gaza, meanwhile, was surrounded by fences, checkpoints, and a tightening blockade. Every day felt like living inside a shrinking cage. Internationally, the world watched in horror. Television screens showed children fleeing tanks, families weeping over bombed-out homes, Israeli buses blown apart by suicide bombers. The peace process, once alive with hope, was now buried under rubble. The death of Yasser Arafat in November 2004, a seismic event shook Palestinian politics. Yasser Arafat, the man who had led the Palestinian cause for decades, fell gravely ill. He was flown to France for treatment, where he died under mysterious circumstances. To Palestinians, Arafat had been a flawed but symbolic leader. His death left a vacuum. Mahmoud Abbas, also known as Abu Mazen, stepped in as his successor. He was less charismatic, less militant, more of a bureaucrat. But the timing could not have been more critical, because Israel was about to make a stunning decision. A shocking announcement in 2003, Ariel Sharon, the same hardliner who had visited the Temple Mount, announced something unthinkable. Israel would withdraw from Gaza. First, nobody believed it. Sharon had been known as the father of the settlements. Why would he dismantle them now? But he argued that holding Gaza was too costly, militarily, economically, and politically. With 8,000 Israeli settlers living among 1.5 million Palestinians, he said it was impossible to maintain. The plan was called disengagement, and in 2005 it became reality. The summer of disengagement, August 2005. The world's cameras focused on Gaza. Israeli soldiers entered Jewish settlements not to protect them, but to evacuate them. Scenes of settlers weeping, clinging to synagogues, refusing to leave, shocked Israel and the world. Families were dragged from their homes by their own army. Within weeks, every Israeli soldier and every Israeli settler was gone from Gaza. Israel had pulled out unilaterally, without negotiating with the Palestinian Authority. For the first time in decades, Gaza was free of Israeli settlements. But was Gaza really free? The withdrawal was historic, but incomplete. Israel still controlled Gaza's borders, airspace, and coastline. Goods and people could only leave or enter with Israeli approval. The airport was shut down. The seaport never opened. The economy remained strangled. And most importantly, the withdrawal left a power vacuum. Would the Palestinian Authority take control? Would Hamas step in? The answer would shape Gaza's destiny. The Second Intifada ended with Gaza transformed. The settlements were gone. Arafat was gone. The Oslo dream was gone. But in the ashes of that chaos, Hamas was rising stronger than ever. And soon, Gaza would explode into civil war, Palestinians fighting Palestinians, with consequences that still haunt the Strip to this very day. A new political era begins. The year was 2006. For the first time since the creation of the Palestinian Authority, Palestinians were heading to the polls in legislative elections. The world expected a clear winner, Fatah, the dominant party of Yasser Arafat, now led by Mahmoud Abbas. But the streets of Gaza told a different story. Hamas, once dismissed as a militant faction, had built schools, hospitals, and charities. Its fighters were seen as incorruptible compared to Fatah's wealthy elites. And when ballots were counted, the result shocked the world. Hamas had won. The shockwaves of Hamas's victory, the international community froze. The US, the EU, and Israel refused to recognize a government led by Hamas, which they considered a terrorist organization. Aid was cut. Financial sanctions hit. Israel withheld tax revenues. Fatah and Hamas, who had long been rivals, now had to share power. But mistrust was deep. Palestinians had voted for change, but instead they got a political earthquake. Gaza streets after the election in Gaza. Hamas's victory was celebrated with fireworks. Supporters chanted slogans of resistance. Posters of Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, assassinated just 2 years earlier, covered walls. But celebration quickly turned to uncertainty. Civil servants went unpaid because international aid was blocked. Tensions grew between Fatah loyalists in the security forces and newly empowered Hamas cadres. The stage was set for confrontation. The first clashes by late 2006. Gun battles erupted between Fatah and Hamas fighters in Gaza streets. At first, it was sporadic, kidnappings, shootouts at checkpoints, rival patrols intimidating each other. But by mid-2007, the violence spiraled into a full-scale civil war. The battle for Gaza, 2007, June 2007. For 1 week, Gaza descended into chaos. Fatah forces, backed with arms from outside, clashed with Hamas fighters in brutal street battles. RPGs and machine guns echoed through Gaza City. Families hid in their homes as rival factions turned neighborhoods into war zones. When the dust settled, the outcome was clear. Hamas had won. Fatah's fighters were routed. Some fled to Egypt or the West Bank. Others were executed in grisly scenes that deepened the divide. By the end of June, Hamas had taken complete control of Gaza. The Palestinian split, the war didn't just change Gaza. It split the entire Palestinian movement. In the West Bank, Mahmoud Abbas and Fatah held power. In Gaza, Hamas ruled unchallenged. Two governments, two ideologies, one fractured nation, and from that moment on, Gaza's fate was sealed. It would become a besieged enclave, ruled by Hamas, cut off from the West Bank, and isolated from much of the world. The international response, the takeover, stunned foreign governments. The US, the EU, and Israel doubled down on sanctions. They sought to weaken Hamas by squeezing Gaza's economy. Israel imposed a strict blockade. Movement of goods and people was restricted to a trickle. Fuel, medicine, and construction materials were limited. Egypt, too, closed its border at Rafah, fearful of Hamas's influence spilling over. Gaza became known as the largest open-air prison in the world. Life under Hamas rule for ordinary Gazans, daily life was transformed. Hamas imposed conservative Islamic laws, though unevenly. Its police patrolled the streets, cracking down on dissent. Smuggling tunnels to Egypt flourished, becoming Gaza's lifeline for food, fuel, and weapons. At the same time, Hamas began to consolidate militarily. Its armed wing, the Izz-ad-Din al-Qassam brigades, built stockpiles of rockets and dug networks of underground tunnels. The Strip was being reshaped, from a fragile experiment in autonomy into a fortress of resistance. Why Hamas's victory mattered globally. The rise of Hamas wasn't just a Palestinian issue. For Israel, it meant facing an adversary sworn to its destruction, now ruling just miles from its southern towns. For the US and Europe, it complicated peace efforts they had spent decades nurturing. For Arab states, it deepened rifts. Some, like Qatar, supported Hamas, while others, like Egypt and Saudi Arabia, feared it. Suddenly, Gaza wasn't just a local conflict. It was a flashpoint in global politics. The human cost of division. While leaders fought for power, ordinary Gazans paid the price. The blockade created shortages of everything: medicine, clean water, electricity. Blackouts became routine. Hospitals ran on generators. Children grew up malnourished. And yet, despite suffering, Hamas maintained support among many Gazans. Why? Because in their eyes, Hamas was standing firm against Israel, while Fatah had compromised and gained nothing. It was a bitter trade-off. Dignity over comfort, resistance over compromise. A new era of conflict looms. By 2007, the situation was clear. Gaza was under Hamas control. The West Bank was under Fatah. Israel and Egypt had locked Gaza in a blockade. The international community was divided on how to respond. The Oslo dream of unity and peace was dead. What replaced it was a grim new reality: a divided Palestine, a besieged Gaza, and an inevitable march toward more wars. For Gaza, the takeover of 2007 was a turning point. No longer just occupied, no longer just negotiating. Now, it was under the rule of a militant movement, cut off, blockaded, and preparing for confrontation. And confrontation would come soon. Because in just 1 year, Gaza would face its first full-scale war with Israel. And the world would never see it the same way again. The countdown to war. By late 2008, Gaza was a pressure cooker. The blockade was strangling life. Hamas was digging tunnels, building rockets, and asserting control. Skirmishes with Israel intensified, rocket fire from Gaza, airstrikes from Israel. Both sides claimed self-defense. But soon it escalated into something much bigger. Operation Cast Lead, 2008 to 2009, December 27, 2008. Without warning, Israel launched Operation Cast Lead. Airstrikes hammered Gaza in the opening minutes, targeting Hamas police stations, government buildings, and weapons depots. Hundreds were killed on the first day alone. Then Israeli ground forces entered Gaza. Tanks rolled across the border. Soldiers fought street-to-street battles with Hamas fighters. The war lasted 22 days. By the end, over 1,300 Palestinians were dead, many of them civilians. Israel lost 13 people, including 10 soldiers. Entire neighborhoods in Gaza lay in ruins. Schools, mosques, and even UN facilities were hit. The world reacted with outrage, but the blockade only tightened. For Gazans, it was the beginning of a new era of wars. Life between wars after the dust settled. Gaza tried to rebuild. But how do you rebuild when concrete is banned from entering, when borders are closed, when electricity is rationed to a few hours a day? Families patched holes in their walls with scrap metal. Children studied by candlelight. Hospitals operated with dwindling supplies. Smuggling tunnels under the Egypt-Gaza border became the only lifeline. Through them came food, medicine, fuel, and weapons. Gaza lived in a constant state of not war, not peace. Everyone knew another conflict was only a matter of time. The Arab Spring and New Hopes, 2011. In 2011, revolutions swept the Arab world. Egypt's dictator Hosni Mubarak was toppled. For Gaza, this was huge. The new Egyptian leadership briefly eased restrictions at the Rafah border crossing. Supplies flowed more freely. Hamas felt emboldened, its allies in the Muslim Brotherhood rising in Cairo. For a moment, Gazans dreamed of breaking free from the blockade. But the dream was short-lived. When Egypt's military returned to power in 2013, the Rafah crossing was slammed shut again. Smuggling tunnels were destroyed. Gaza was once again isolated. Operation Pillar of Defense 2012. In November 2012, after weeks of rising tension, Israel launched another offensive, Operation Pillar of Defense. This time, the war lasted just 8 days. It began with Israel assassinating Ahmed Jabari, Hamas's military chief, in a pinpoint airstrike. Hamas responded with hundreds of rockets, some reaching Tel Aviv and Jerusalem for the first time. Israel bombed Gaza relentlessly, targeting rocket sites and infrastructure. When the ceasefire was brokered by Egypt, the toll was grim: 167 Palestinians killed, 6 Israelis killed. Though shorter than the last war, the psychological scars ran deep. And it showed something new. Hamas's rockets were reaching deeper into Israel than ever before. The tunnel war during these years, Hamas invested heavily in underground tunnels. Some were smuggling tunnels into Egypt. Others were attack tunnels built under the Gaza-Israel border, designed to infiltrate Israeli territory. These tunnels terrified Israelis living near Gaza and gave Hamas leverage. For Gazans, they were both a lifeline and a symbol of resistance. But Israel was determined to destroy them, setting the stage for the next and deadliest war. Operation Protective Edge, 2014. July 2014. The spark was the kidnapping and killing of 3 Israeli teenagers in the West Bank. Israel blamed Hamas, launching mass arrests and raids. Hamas retaliated with rockets from Gaza. Within days, Israel launched Operation Protective Edge. It became the longest and deadliest war Gaza had ever seen. The fighting lasted 50 days. Over 2,200 Palestinians were killed, including hundreds of children. More than 70 Israelis were killed, most of them soldiers. The scale of destruction in Gaza was catastrophic. Entire neighborhoods leveled. Schools and UN shelters bombed. Over 100,000 people left homeless. Israel justified the war as an effort to stop rocket fire and destroy Hamas's tunnels. But to Gazans, it was another massacre. The world reacts. The images shocked the world. Children pulled from rubble. Families sheltering in bombed-out schools. Entire blocks reduced to dust. Protests erupted in cities worldwide. UN officials called it a humanitarian catastrophe. But at the end of it all, nothing had changed. The blockade remained. Hamas stayed in power. Israel declared victory, but rockets still flew, and Gazans were left with ruins again. Life after 2014. By the end of 2014, Gaza was in ruins for the third time in 6 years. Electricity came for only a few hours a day. Unemployment soared above 40. International donors pledged billions for reconstruction, but little reached ordinary people. Children grew up knowing only war, and Hamas, battered but unbroken, prepared for the next round. From 2008 to 2014, Gaza endured 3 devastating wars. Each time, the Strip was left in ruins. Each time, the blockade grew tighter. Each time, Hamas claimed survival as victory. But after 2014, the conflict would take on new forms. Protests, fire kites, sniper bullets, and another brutal war in 2021. And as the years went on, the world began asking, how much more could Gaza endure? Picking up the pieces, 2015 to 2017, after the devastation of 2014, Gaza was in ruins again. International donors pledged $5.4 billion for reconstruction. But much of it never arrived. Political infighting between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority stalled rebuilding projects. Israel's blockade choked imports of cement and steel. By 2017, tens of thousands were still living in tents or makeshift shelters. Rubble piled up where entire neighborhoods once stood. And amid the destruction, Gaza's people grew angrier, hungrier, more desperate. A political shift in Hamas in 2017, Hamas elected Yahya Sinwar as its new leader in Gaza. A former prisoner held by Israel for 22 years, Sinwar was seen as a hardliner. Yet at times, he signaled willingness to negotiate if it meant easing the blockade. But Israel and Hamas were locked in a stalemate. Neither side wanted another full war, yet neither side offered real peace. The Strip simmered, waiting for the next explosion. The Great March of Return, 2018, March 30th, 2018. Tens of thousands of Gazans marched toward the border fence with Israel. They called it the Great March of Return. Their demand was simple but powerful: the right of Palestinian refugees and their descendants to return to the lands they had lost in 1948. But the protests were about more than history. They were about today: crushing unemployment, electricity cuts that left families in darkness, a blockade that felt like slow suffocation. Week after week, thousands marched. Families brought tents. Children waved flags. But the response was brutal. Snipers at the fence, Israeli forces deployed along the border. They declared the protests a security threat, accusing Hamas of using them as cover to infiltrate. Snipers were ordered to open fire on those approaching the fence. The result was shocking. In the first weeks alone, dozens of unarmed protesters were killed. By the end of 2019, over 200 Palestinians had been shot dead, and more than 8,000 wounded, many left permanently disabled. Images of medics, journalists, and children being shot reverberated worldwide. For Gaza, the protests were both a cry for dignity and another chapter of bloodshed. Kites, balloons, and fire as protests raged. A new form of resistance emerged. Gazans began flying kites and balloons carrying firebombs across the border. Fields in southern Israel burned. To Palestinians, it was a symbol of creativity under siege. To Israelis, it was another act of terror. The cycle of attack and retaliation deepened. Airstrikes hit Gaza. Rockets answered. The Strip remained trapped in limbo. The pandemic and collapse, 2020. When COVID-19 struck in 2020, Gaza was already one of the most vulnerable places on Earth. Its hospitals lacked medicine, equipment, and electricity. Clean water was scarce. Quarantine centers were overcrowded. The blockade turned a health crisis into a humanitarian nightmare. But while the world fought the pandemic, Gaza braced for something even worse. Jerusalem ignites again, 2021. May 2021. Tensions in Jerusalem boiled over. Israeli settlers tried to evict Palestinian families from their homes in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood. At the same time, Israeli police raided Al-Aqsa Mosque during Ramadan, firing tear gas and rubber bullets inside Islam's third holiest site. The images enraged Palestinians everywhere. And in Gaza, Hamas issued an ultimatum. Israel must withdraw its forces from Al-Aqsa and Sheikh Jarrah. When the deadline passed, rockets flew. Operation Guardian of the Walls 2021. For 11 days, Gaza and Israel were locked in one of their most intense battles yet. Hamas launched over 4,300 rockets at Israel, the most in its history. Some reached as far as Tel Aviv and even near Haifa. Israel unleashed relentless airstrikes. Apartment towers, government buildings, and media offices were reduced to rubble. The human cost was devastating. Over 250 Palestinians were killed, including dozens of children. 13 Israelis were killed. Entire families were wiped out in their homes. The world watched in horror as live streams showed Gaza's skyline lit up with fire. Global outrage and solidarity. The 2021 war sparked unprecedented protests worldwide. From New York to London to Cape Town, millions demanded an end to the bombing. On social media, images of Gazan children became viral symbols of suffering. The narrative shifted. Gaza wasn't just a war zone. It was a humanitarian crisis that the world could no longer ignore. But for Gazans, outrage abroad meant little when bombs fell at home. The ceasefire and aftermath. When the ceasefire was declared on May 21, 2021, Gaza lay in ruins once more. High-rises were dust. Roads were cratered. Power plants barely functioned. Thousands were displaced. And the blockade still remained. For Hamas, survival was enough to claim victory. For Israel, the war weakened Hamas but didn't destroy it. For ordinary Gazans, it was another nightmare in a long cycle with no end in sight. October 7, 2023. The unthinkable. It was a Saturday morning. Across Israel, families were celebrating Simchat Torah, one of the holiest days in the Jewish calendar. Few imagined what was about to happen. At dawn, Hamas launched a surprise assault of unprecedented scale. Thousands of rockets fired within minutes, overwhelming Israel's Iron Dome defense system. But this wasn't just rockets. Militants breached the border with paragliders, motorcycles, and bulldozers. They stormed towns, kibbutzim, and even a music festival. The scenes were shocking. Over 1,200 Israelis were killed in a single day, the deadliest attack on Jews since the Holocaust. Civilians were gunned down in their homes. More than 240 hostages, including children and elderly, were dragged into Gaza. For Israel, this was not just another flare-up. It was a national trauma. Israel's declaration of war within hours. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu declared, "Israel is at war." What followed was a campaign unlike any Gaza had ever seen. Israel vowed to destroy Hamas completely. The military response was immediate and massive. Airstrikes targeted Gaza's leadership, infrastructure, and neighborhoods. The Strip was placed under complete siege. No electricity, no water, no fuel, no food. Netanyahu compared Hamas to ISIS. Israeli officials said the goal was not just deterrence, but elimination. The humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza. But in a place as densely packed as Gaza, war is never clean. Airstrikes flattened entire apartment blocks. Hospitals overflowed with casualties. Families were buried under rubble. The United Nations sounded the alarm. This was the fastest-growing humanitarian disaster in recent history. By December 2023, estimates suggested over 20,000 Palestinians had been killed, thousands of them children. By early 2024, the toll climbed even higher. The images were unbearable. Children pulled from debris, families carrying white flags only to be struck, doctors performing surgeries without anesthesia in darkened hospitals. For Gaza's 2.3 million people, there was no safe place. The ground invasion. In late October, Israel launched its ground invasion. Tanks and soldiers pushed into northern Gaza, encircling Gaza City, the stronghold of Hamas. Street battles raged. Israel claimed to destroy tunnels, weapons depots, and command centers. But Gaza's urban warfare was brutal. Civilians were trapped between two forces. Hamas, accused of using civilian infrastructure as shields. Israel, accused of disproportionate strikes that devastated entire neighborhoods. The world debated, was this a legitimate war against terror? Or was it collective punishment on a trapped population? Hostage crisis and ceasefire deals. The hostage situation became central. Families of those taken on October 7th campaigned relentlessly, demanding their government prioritize bringing them home. In late November, a temporary ceasefire was brokered by Qatar, Egypt, and the U.S. Dozens of Israeli hostages were released in exchange for Palestinian prisoners. For a brief moment, the guns fell silent. Gazans rushed to find food, water, and shelter. Families reunited. But soon, fighting resumed, fiercer than before. Global protests and divisions. The war ignited protests worldwide, unlike anything seen since the Iraq War. In Western capitals, hundreds of thousands marched demanding a ceasefire. In Muslim-majority nations, solidarity with Gaza reached fever pitch. Universities, parliaments, and streets were filled with debates over justice, terrorism, and genocide. Western governments largely backed Israel, citing its right to self-defense. But global public opinion shifted dramatically toward Gaza as civilian deaths mounted. Social media amplified every image, every child lost, every bombing caught on camera. The battle for narrative became as fierce as the battle on the ground. Regional tensions boil over the Gaza war risked igniting the entire Middle East. Hezbollah in Lebanon fired rockets at northern Israel. Militias in Iraq and Syria targeted U.S. bases. Yemen's Houthis attacked Red Sea shipping lanes in solidarity with Gaza. For a moment, it seemed the conflict might spiral into a full regional war. The U.S. deployed aircraft carriers. Iran issued threats. Diplomats scrambled to contain the fire. Life under siege. By early 2024, Gaza was unrecognizable. Neighborhoods once filled with bustling markets were reduced to gray rubble. Schools became shelters. Shelters became graveyards. The UN warned of famine. Disease spread through crowded refugee camps. Children grew up knowing nothing but war, hunger, and loss. One UN official declared, "Gaza is becoming a graveyard for children." Israel's dilemma. Despite the massive military campaign, Hamas was not eliminated. Its leadership remained hidden. Its tunnels stretched for miles underground. Its fighters melted into civilian areas. Israel faced a dilemma: stay and risk endless urban warfare. Leave and risk Hamas regrouping. Meanwhile, international pressure mounted. Allies like the U.S. urged restraint. Critics accused Israel of war crimes. Netanyahu insisted the war would continue until victory. But what victory looked like was unclear. The war in 2025. As of 2025, the conflict grinds on. Gaza's death toll has surpassed 30,000 by some counts. Israel remains traumatized by October 7th, with hostages still unaccounted for. Diplomatic talks continue, but mistrust runs deep. And Gaza's future? Still uncertain. Will it be rebuilt? Will it remain under siege? Will new leaders emerge from the ashes? No one knows. A land forever on the edge. From 1948 to 2025, the Gaza Strip has been more than a battlefield. It has been a symbol of displacement, where families driven from their ancestral homes still cling to the dream of return. A symbol of resistance, where fighters, leaders, and ordinary citizens stood against overwhelming odds. A symbol of suffering, where generations grew up knowing bombs, blockades, and endless grief. And yet, somehow, Gaza also became a symbol of endurance. Because despite everything, despite rubble, hunger, and loss, Gaza has never disappeared. The cycles of conflict. Looking back, the pattern is haunting. 1948, the Nakba, when Gaza became a crowded refugee camp. 1967, the occupation, when Israeli forces took control. 1987 and 2000, the uprisings, when stone throwers and fighters challenged the status quo. 2007 onward, the blockade, when life became survival under siege. 2008, 2012, 2014, 2021, and 2023. The wars, each more destructive than the last. It is a cycle of hope, revolt, repression, and ruin. And yet, each time, Gaza rises from the ashes. A human story beyond politics, but behind the politics, behind the leaders and the armies, lies the real story. The people. The child who studies by candlelight because the power is cut. The mother who cooks with firewood because there's no gas. The fisherman who risks gunfire just to feed his family. The doctor who performs surgery without medicine. The teacher who tells his students about a world they may never see. These lives rarely make headlines, but they are Gaza's heartbeat. The world's mirror. Gaza has also been a mirror for the world. It forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. What does justice mean? Who decides whose lives matter more? Can security for one people come at the price of despair for another? The debates rage on. Some see Gaza through the lens of terrorism, others through the lens of human rights. But beyond debates, one truth stands. Millions of human beings remain trapped in a reality no one would accept for themselves. Uncertain futures. So what lies ahead? There are several possibilities, none guaranteed. A negotiated settlement, where Gaza is rebuilt, Hamas is replaced, and Palestinians finally achieve statehood. Continued conflict, where sieges, strikes, and uprisings repeat endlessly, with no solution in sight. Regional transformation, where shifting alliances in the Middle East either isolate Gaza further or bring it into a larger peace process. What is certain is that the status quo cannot last forever. Something will change. The question is whether it will be for peace or for another catastrophe. Gaza's lessons for the world. The history of Gaza is not just about Gaza. It is about the dangers of ignoring injustice. It is about how despair can breed violence and how violence can breed more despair. It is about how walls and borders may stop movement but not memory. Most of all, Gaza's story teaches us that human dignity cannot be bombed out, starved out, or locked out. Because even under siege, people sing. Even in ruins, children play. Even in the darkest night, hope flickers. So when we look at Gaza today, we are not just looking at a strip of land. We are looking at 75 years of history compressed into 25 miles. We are looking at the scars of war and the unbroken will of a people. We are looking at one of the greatest unresolved struggles of modern times. The question is not whether Gaza will survive. It already has. The real question is, will the world ever let Gaza live in peace? If you've made it this far, thank you for walking through history with us. The story of Gaza is long, painful, and unfinished, but it's a story the world must remember. If this documentary moved you, make sure to like this video, share it with others, and subscribe for more deep dives into the untold chapters of history. And tell us in the comments, what lessons do you take from Gaza's story? Do you believe peace is possible in our lifetime? Because history is not just about the past. It's about the choices we make today and the futures they will create.